Hello, apes, and welcome to screencast number 4 of Chapter 2, the Earth's physical properties, physical systems, matter, energy, and geology. And I went over a little bit yesterday, the last screencast, because I was so excited to be talking about living systems because biology is what I really like. So, biology and AP environmental science are my favorites. So polymers, we were talking about polymers, and I told you that it was they're made up of smaller compounds that are called monomers, and that process of making polymers is called polymerization. And again, these are things that you should have learned in biology, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over it. So if you have questions, you got to go back and refresh your memory on that. Okay, so here is a carbon skeleton, and let's get this to play. So all of those are chains of carbon. It can come in chains, it can come in branching. This would be a branch, this would be a chain, and this would be a ring. And these are the different kinds of carbon skeletons that can form in organic molecules. Okay, so matter, as you can imagine, everything is composed of both organic and inorganic compounds. We're going to learn about hydrocarbons. And hydrocarbons are carbons that contain only carbon and hydrogen. So the simplest hydrocarbon is methane, which is natural gas. The hydrocarbons can be in the form of all three states, gas, liquid, or a solid. And most of our fossil fuels are hydrocarbons. And some of these hydrocarbons can be very harmful to wildlife. As I mentioned in a previous screencast, this summer I went to a wedding out in Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, and they had 4 hydrofracking sites within an 8-mile radius. And what they're doing is they're actually drilling down to about 10,000 feet under the Earth's surface, and they are fracturing the shale, which is what holds the mantle, holds the crust together on the Earth's surface. And when they break that shale, they force water and sand down into the ground to break it. And then that releases any gas, natural gas, that happens to be stored in that shale. And they collect that, and the wastewater, which then contains toxins, they pool in a pond, and they let sit in a pond. So as you can imagine, this is harmful to the wildlife. There's mountaintop, not mountaintop, there's another means of extracting fossil fuels that actually makes a toxic sludge pool that a bird lands in it, and it's dead instantly. So these ponds can do the same thing because some of these hydrocarbons can be very harmful. So here is the chemical structure of some hydrocarbons. Methane gas is, again, the most common, and you can see it's the most simple. And then ethane, C2H6. We've got our carbon backbone here with our hydrogens. And this is naphthalene, and you can see it actually forms a double ringed structure. Do you remember what a double ring is called? Like a pyrimidine or a purine? Do you remember those terms? We're not going to worry about them, but I'm just asking. But you can see this double ring structure, and the carbon is at the backbone, and the hydrogens are all off of that. Okay, so we mentioned polymers as being long chains of repeated molecules, and we talked about carbohydrates being an example of a polymer. but plastics are also polymers. And we're going to talk about the dangers of those plastics. I wonder why that keeps skipping like that. Okay, let's try this one. Oh, darn, I thought I had it. Let's try again. There's no play. Let's try again. There we go. So here's how a polysaccharide would form. And starch, when it's saved in the liver, it's called glycogen. That's stored starch. And then cellulose, you might remember, is part of the plant cell structure, which helps make it rigid. So you can see the three differences here in those. So we know that through the process of polymerization and with organic compounds, that these form the macromolecules, giant size molecules. And there are three types of polymers that are associated to these macromolecules that are essential for living things. And they are proteins, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. Lipids don't fall under the category of polymers, but they're still an essential macromolecule. And I don't think, when we had biology, I don't think I explained that they were the polymers and that lipids were not considered a polymer. But they're fats and they're oils, and they're important in storing energy. We know that lipids make up the phospholipids, the phosphates and the lipids in our cell membrane. So that's important because that helps to regulate what can enter and leave the cell. We know that they serve as steroids in humans, and they enable those steroids to work as hormones. Where in comparison, our proteins are going to do a whole slew of activities. They're going to fight disease. They're going to be part of membrane structure. They're going to help catalyze chemical reactions as some of the things that they do. Nucleic acids, we know DNA and RNA. DNA is huge. It's so important for our genetic information that, I joke about it, having a freckle on your cheek on your face versus a freckle on the cheek of your butt. The directions are there, and it tells you that. And then carbohydrates, like our monosaccharides and disaccharides, they're essential quick energy. And then our starch, another form of quick energy. A lot of athletes will eat starchy meals before a meet for that energy source because it can be broken down in the presence of water. You don't have to exert any energy for that. So again, proteins, that's all that I've said before. They're long chains of amino acids. So they're the polymer of these amino acids. And remember, an amino acid contains an amino group, a carboxyl group. A carboxyl is characteristic of an acid, and then a variable. And that variable changed the type of amino acid. And we know that there's 20 different amino acids that exist. And like letters of the alphabet, you arrange those amino acids in a certain way, and you're going to get a specific type of protein. Protein for hair color, eye color, structural support. Again, another way of storing energy. Transporting materials. Remember, I showed the Harvard life of the cell and that motor protein that was walking along the microtubule, carrying that vesicle. Transport. Animals use proteins to make their skin and their hair and their muscles and their tendons. As I said, in fighting disease, they're components of your immune system. They're going to work as hormones as well. And they're going to serve as enzymes to catalyze reactions, to promote chemical reactions so that we don't need as much heat energy to cause those reactions, or you might remember it as activation energy. Nucleic acids, we discussed, are made up of long chains of nucleotides. And remember, a nucleotide in itself is a polymer because it's made up of a phosphate group, which is phosphorus and oxygen. It's PO4. and a sugar, which is a pentose sugar, and that pentose sugar could be deoxyribose, which is a sugar without oxygen, it's missing an oxygen, or ribose, and nitrogenous bases, or a nitrogen base, and it would be one nitrogen base. And there were 4 different nitrogenous bases, actually 5 if you consider RNA, and that's adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, and RNA had uracil. So the 2 types of nucleic acids are deoxyribonucleic acid, our master molecule that's responsible for carrying the directions in the sequence to make the proteins, and ribonucleic acid, which is going to be the worker, the messenger, and is going to help make the proteins. And we know that the difference is where DNA, this huge molecule, it forms a double helix, a 2-sided molecule that kind of spirals. And it spirals so that it can fit into a single cell. If we were to take out the DNA from a single cell, from one cell, it would be 6 feet long. Wow! And it's in this tiny little cell that you need a microscope to look at. And that's because of the way it's all coiled together. RNA, on the other hand, it's a single cell molecule, a single strand, not cells, single stranded molecule. There's 3 different types, and it serves as the messenger and the maker of the proteins. So when we talk about genes, and to clarify genes, genes are the areas on that DNA that code specifically for proteins that perform specific functions within the cell or that organism. And I think what people don't realize is there's parts of that DNA that don't really code for anything. And it's kind of like the spaces in the sentence. You can have words, those are your specific regions, they're your genes, and then you have a space so that you can tell each word apart. And there's parts of the DNA that do that, that add the spaces so we know exactly the proteins that need to be produced and that they're not being all jumbled together as one big giant sequence. So here is that DNA, here's that nucleotide, this phosphate group, and that phosphate group is a PO4 group. Our sugar is a pentose sugar. And our nitrogenous base could be adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, that's a G, cytosine, and if we're an RNA, uracil. So that's what a nitrogenous base is. And a nitrogenous base, it has nitrogen in its makeup, and it's a base. So that means it has more hydroxide ions than hydrogen ions. So each one of these nucleotides make up this double helix of DNA. And the backbone that holds it together is that sugar phosphate backbone. So this is what makes the backbone of the DNA. All right, that's the DNA double helix chemically. Isn't that cool? Awesome. And that wraps around histones and nucleosomes really tight so it can fit into the cell. All right, we're 14 minutes in. I'm going to stop here and we'll continue with carbohydrates in the next screencast.